Raymond Johnson's day had been long. He had just wrapped up another intense session in court, a case that had taken everything from him: his time, his patience, and his spirit. But that was the life of a lawyer, especially one like Raymond. He was well known, respected, and feared in the legal world. But none of that mattered to the police officers patrolling the affluent neighborhood just a few blocks away from the courthouse. The sun was beginning to set as Raymond walked down the sidewalk, the cool evening air settling around him. His thoughts were a blur, racing through legal jargon and strategies for his next case. But he felt a sense of relief as he left the courtroom. He was proud of the work he did, proud of the difference he was making. He was known for fighting for the underdog, for the vulnerable, for people whose voices were too often drowned out by the system. But on this particular evening, no one seemed to care about the man who had spent the day advocating for justice. No one cared that Raymond Johnson was an accomplished lawyer, a beacon of hope for many. As he walked toward his car, parked a few blocks away, he noticed a police car idling by the curb. The siren wasn't on, and there wasn't anything particularly alarming about the situation. But the moment he took another step, something shifted. The police car pulled forward slowly, the two officers inside watching him with sharp, calculating eyes. Raymond kept walking, his pace steady, but his heart picked up a beat, sensing something wasn't quite right. "Hey you! Stop right there!" The voice was gruff, commanding, with a tinge of hostility that instantly made Raymond's stomach drop. He turned toward the officer, but before he could respond, the second officer had already stepped out of the car, hand on his holstered weapon. Raymond's mind went blank for a moment, processing the situation too slowly. Was he being detained? Did they have any reason to stop him? The officers advanced on him, their eyes scanning him up and down, like he was something to be inspected. Raymond stood still, his mind racing, his instincts telling him to remain calm. But as the officers moved closer, the words that slipped from their mouths hit him with the force of 1,000 pounds. "You're looking suspicious, walking around here," the first officer said, his voice tight with unspoken assumptions. "You need to show us what's in your pockets." Raymond was no stranger to being racially profiled. He'd experienced it before, as a young man trying to make a name for himself in a world that seemed stacked against him. He'd seen it in his father's eyes, the quiet rage that simmered below the surface when he spoke about the injustices he'd faced. But nothing could have prepared Raymond for the reality of it. The feeling of being reduced to a stereotype in a moment, stripped of his accomplishments, his identity, his worth. He wasn't a lawyer now. He wasn't a man who had just spent hours fighting for people's rights. He was a suspicious black man in an affluent neighborhood. He raised his hands slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "I'm not carrying anything illegal," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just walking to my car." But the officers didn't seem convinced. Without warning, the first officer grabbed his arm and yanked it behind his back, the cold metal of handcuffs biting into his wrists. Raymond flinched but didn't resist. He knew how quickly things could escalate, how quickly the situation could spiral out of control if he made a move that even hinted at defiance. "Turn around," the second officer barked. Raymond complied, his mind screaming in disbelief. This wasn't happening. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him. Not after everything he had fought for. He could feel the weight of the handcuffs, the humiliation flooding through him. But he refused to let the shame consume him. He knew his rights. He had fought for people's rights for years. He wasn't about to let this moment define him. "Do you know who I am?" Raymond asked, his voice still steady but now tinged with frustration. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he roughly frisked Raymond, his hands moving over Raymond's suit jacket, his pockets. Nothing. There was nothing to find. Raymond's mind flashed to his family. His mother, his daughter, the community he fought for. They were all counting on him. But in that moment he felt small. He was just another black man in America. Just another statistic, another name in a long line of injustices. The officers finally stopped, seemingly satisfied that there was nothing on him. They stood there momentarily silent, Then one of the officers finally spoke. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone not as aggressive but still laced with suspicion. "Raymond Johnson," he replied, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm a lawyer." There was a pause. The officer's face changed, the recognition flickering in his eyes. Raymond had seen that look before, the look of realization that they had just messed with someone far more important than they had realized. But the damage was done. The video was already out there. A bystander had been recording the entire interaction. The moment the officer's aggressive actions were captured on video, it was only a matter of time before it went viral. Raymond's face was already all over social media. The community was waking up to the reality of what had just happened. The video was already spreading like wildfire. The video spread like wildfire. It was everywhere on social media, news outlets, blogs, and even television. It became the talk of the town, and soon it became the talk of the nation. The footage showed Raymond Johnson being handcuffed by two officers in a wealthy neighborhood. The reason given being that he looked suspicious. The clear implication of racial profiling was undeniable. The images of Raymond, his face tense, his hands bound, spread across screens in an instant, sparking an outcry that was hard to ignore. At first, Raymond sat in his car, staring blankly at the screen of his phone, the notifications flooding in. He wasn't sure how long he had been sitting there. Minutes? Hours? His hands trembled slightly as he read through the comments and messages. Some were supportive, but many were filled with anger and disbelief. People from all walks of life all over the country were reacting to the injustice of the situation. The media outlets couldn't get enough of the story. News anchors and commentators dissected the video, analyzing every word spoken, every movement made. The hashtag Justice for Raymond quickly trended, with people offering their support in a wave of digital solidarity. But among the supportive voices, there were those who still tried to defend the officers. The debate over what had happened escalated to levels that Raymond had never anticipated. He sat quietly, absorbing it all, but a storm brewed inside him. He had spent his entire life fighting for justice, for those who had been wronged by the system. He had worked tirelessly, sacrificing so much to get where he was today. But now it seemed like none of that mattered. In the eyes of those officers, he was just another black man walking in a neighborhood where he didn't belong. Raymond took a deep breath and dialed his lawyer, an old friend from law school, Sarah Mitchell. She had been with him during many of his toughest battles, and he trusted her more than anyone. As soon as she picked up, Raymond could hear the worry in her voice. "I saw the video, Raymond," Sarah said, her tone gentle but firm. "You need to do something about this. You can't let them get away with this. You're a symbol now. This isn't just about you anymore." Raymond leaned back in his seat, staring at the glowing screen of his phone. The message was clear. The world had seen what had happened. They had seen the way the officers treated him, the humiliation he endured. They had seen the way the system had failed him. "I know, Sarah," he replied, his voice steady despite the fury that still simmered beneath the surface. "But I don't know what to do. I don't want this to define me, but I also can't let it go. If I don't do something, then what kind of example does that set?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sarah knew Raymond better than anyone. She knew how much he hated being the center of attention, how much he disliked the idea of using his personal pain to make a political statement. But she also knew how deeply this injustice had hurt him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the countless others who had experienced the same thing. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. "I'll help you, but you need to speak up. People need to hear your story. They need to see who you really are." And so Raymond made the decision. He would fight back. Not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been unfairly targeted, humiliated, and ignored. He would use his platform, his voice, to make sure that the injustice he had faced wouldn't be swept under the rug. The next day, Raymond called a press conference. The room was packed. Reporters, cameras, microphones, they were all there, waiting for him to speak. Raymond had prepared himself for this moment, but as he stood at the podium, he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The tension in the air was palpable. Everyone was waiting for him to say something that would either define this moment or make it fade away. Raymond took a deep breath, looking out at the sea of faces before him. His voice was calm but resolute as he spoke. "I'm standing here today not just as a lawyer," he began, his eyes scanning the crowd, "but as a man who was humiliated for no reason other than the color of his skin. I was walking home just like anyone else, and I was stopped, harassed by the police for nothing more than looking suspicious. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know what I do. They didn't care. I was just another black man in a place I wasn't supposed to be." He paused, his words sinking in. The room was silent now, every eye on him. "But I am more than what they saw. I am a lawyer. I fight for justice. I fight for the people who don't have a voice. And I will fight for my dignity just as I would fight for anyone else's," Raymond continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "What happened to me should never have happened. And it cannot happen again." Raymond could see the reporters scribbling notes, the cameras flashing as his words hit home. But there was something else in the room now, an energy. A spark of something greater than just a story. This was more than just an isolated incident. This was about a larger problem, a system that perpetuated inequality and discrimination, and Raymond had just made it personal for everyone in that room. The media picked up Raymond's speech and it reverberated across the country. People who had never met him before suddenly felt a connection to him. His words resonated with their own experiences, their own struggles. The backlash against the police grew stronger. Protesters took to the streets in support, calling for accountability, calling for change. But the most surprising twist of all was the number of people who reached out to Raymond personally, people from all walks of life, from different races, different backgrounds, all united by a common cause. Raymond's decision to speak up had made him a symbol of resistance, a symbol of hope. Raymond had hoped that speaking out would bring some clarity to the situation, some sense of resolution. But as the days passed, it became clear that the road ahead was not going to be easy. The backlash against the police was powerful, but so was the resistance from the establishment. As his case began to gain traction, Raymond found himself thrust into a media whirlwind that neither he nor his family had anticipated. The pressure mounted as the public began to demand action. Social media posts flooded in, calling for accountability, justice, and reforms within the police force. But there was also a wave of opposition. Some pundits, some political figures argued that Raymond was playing the race card, that he had exaggerated the situation to further his career, to feed into a narrative that painted the police as the villains. The accusations stung, but Raymond was resolute. He had seen the system at its worst and knew that silence would only allow it to continue. Raymond's legal team worked tirelessly to prepare for the lawsuit. They filed charges against the police officers for racial discrimination, false imprisonment, and harassment. But as they delved deeper into the case, it became clear that this wasn't just about two officers acting on their own accord. There were institutional forces at play, unspoken biases, patterns of racial profiling, and a culture within the department that made it more likely for people like Raymond to be targeted. Raymond's team, led by his trusted lawyer Sarah Mitchell, began to uncover troubling evidence about the officers involved in the stop. Both had previous complaints of racial profiling lodged against them. There were instances where they had disproportionately stopped Black and Latino men in predominantly white neighborhoods. The evidence painted a damning picture, but Raymond couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the tip of the iceberg. As his lawyers worked on the case, Raymond began to feel the emotional weight of it all. The man who had once been filled with a sense of purpose, who had fought for justice in countless courtrooms, now found himself fighting for his own. But it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the system, about the thousands of people who had been wronged in the same way. He couldn't back down now, not when the stakes were this high. One morning, Raymond sat in his office reviewing documents when Sarah walked in, a concerned look on her face. "We've got something," she said, holding up a stack of papers. "We just got access to some of the officers' past reports. It's worse than we thought." Raymond looked up from his desk, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "They've been involved in a pattern of racial profiling for years. But it gets worse. They were under pressure from their superiors to keep order in the wealthy neighborhoods. They were told to keep an eye on certain types of people, and I'm sure you can guess who those people were." Raymond's heart sank. This wasn't just a case of a few bad apples, it was a deeper, systemic issue. The officers hadn't just acted out of personal bias, they had been part of a larger effort to maintain the status quo, to protect the image of wealthy neighborhoods at the cost of marginalized communities. The truth was more insidious than he could have imagined. As the investigation unfolded, the media was quick to pick up on these new revelations. The public outrage grew, and soon the case became a national issue. The hashtag Justice for Raymond exploded on social media, gaining momentum by the day. Protests sprang up across the country, calling for police reform and accountability. But amidst the growing support, there was also a fierce backlash. Some politicians, some media outlets, began to question Raymond's intentions. They called his motives into question, arguing that he was seeking revenge rather than justice. They painted him as an opportunist, a man using his race and the police incident to advance his career. The weight of the scrutiny was heavy, and Raymond felt the sting of every unkind word, every accusation that questioned his integrity. It was during this turbulent time that Raymond decided to take control of the narrative. He had spent years in courtrooms, crafting legal arguments, cross-examining witnesses. But now he was going to speak directly to the people. He was going to tell his story, not just as a lawyer, but as a man who had been wronged by the system he had spent his life trying to fix. A press conference was scheduled, and the anticipation was palpable. The room was packed with reporters, journalists, and cameras. Raymond stood at the podium, his suit crisp, his demeanor calm but determined. He knew what was at stake. This was his chance to set the record straight and show the world who he really was. The room fell silent as Raymond began to speak. "I'm standing here today not as a lawyer, not as a man of privilege, but as someone who has experienced firsthand what it's like to be treated as less than human simply because of the color of my skin." The incident that took place a few days ago was not an isolated event. It is part of a larger problem, a problem that affects so many of us, day in and day out. His voice didn't waver, and the words flowed from him with a clarity and conviction that resonated with everyone in the room. "People keep asking me why I'm doing this. They ask why I'm speaking out, why I'm risking my career and my reputation. The answer is simple: because I refuse to stay silent. I refuse to let what happened to me, what happens to so many others, be swept under the rug. This isn't just about one bad encounter with the police. This is about a system that is broken. This is about a country that prides itself on justice, but where so many are denied that justice simply because of who they are." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The reporters sat on the edge of their seats, hanging on to every word. "I'm not doing this for fame. I'm not doing this for money. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. I'm doing this because there are millions of people out there who feel the same way I do, people who are tired of being targeted, tired of being treated like criminals when all they're doing is living their lives." Raymond's voice grew more impassioned as he spoke, and it was clear to everyone in the room that he wasn't just speaking for himself, he was speaking for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. "When I was a kid, I was taught that the law was supposed to protect us all. But I've learned that the law doesn't always protect people like me. And that's why we need change. That's why we need accountability. We need a system that serves everyone, not just the privileged few." The room erupted in applause. It wasn't just the words, it was the power behind them. The sincerity in Raymond's voice struck a chord with everyone who heard it. This wasn't a man playing politics. This was a man who had lived through the pain and who was determined to make sure no one else had to suffer in the same way. The press conference was a turning point. The story of Raymond Johnson wasn't just a news story anymore, it was a movement. People from all walks of life rallied behind him, supporting his cause and demanding change. But the battle was far from over. The police officers involved in the incident would not go down without a fight, and the deeper Raymond dug, the more corruption and bias he uncovered. But Raymond wasn't backing down. He couldn't. Not now. In the days following Raymond's press conference, the momentum continued to build. The public outcry over the police officers' actions didn't just remain a news cycle, it became a catalyst for something much bigger. Activists, civil rights organizations, and even ordinary citizens rallied together to demand answers, pushing for an investigation into not just the officers involved in Raymond's case but the entire police department's policies regarding racial profiling. Raymond's legal team, now backed by public support and the power of a viral movement, began digging into the officers' pasts. They scrutinized every case, every report, every complaint that had ever been filed against them. What they discovered shocked even them. Both officers had a history of questionable actions. Officer Mark Daniels, the one who had first stopped Raymond, had been the subject of multiple complaints in the past. One incident, dating back 5 years, involved him pulling over a black family on the highway under suspicious circumstances. The family had been driving through a predominantly white area when Daniels had stopped them, claiming their vehicle looked suspicious. No charges had been filed and Daniels had been cleared of any wrongdoing, but the incident had been swept under the rug. Officer Kelly Brooks, the second officer involved in Raymond's stop, had a similar track record. She had been part of several high-profile cases of racial profiling, and it seemed that her actions had always been dismissed by the department. There were reports of her stopping young black men walking through affluent neighborhoods without cause, questioning them about their presence without offering any legitimate reason for the stops. But it wasn't just the officers' personal histories that were troubling, it was the systemic nature of the problem. Raymond's legal team uncovered internal memos that revealed a disturbing pattern within the police department. Officers had been under pressure to maintain control over the wealthy neighborhoods. The memo, dated just months before Raymond's incident, explicitly advised officers to keep an eye on suspicious individuals in those areas, which, in practice, meant stopping and questioning anyone who didn't fit the profile of the typical affluent resident. Raymond and his team were stunned. It wasn't just a few rogue officers. It was an institutional problem. The department itself had actively fostered a culture of racial profiling, and the officers were merely following orders that had been ingrained in them. It was a deeply rooted issue that went beyond individual misconduct. It was embedded within the very structure of law enforcement in this community. But the investigation didn't stop there. As more information came to light, it became clear that the officers involved in Raymond's case had been acting under direct pressure from their superiors. Captain Richard Hayes, a well-respected figure in the department, had signed off on the policies that allowed for racial profiling to continue unchecked. He had pushed for more aggressive patrols in areas with higher property values, with little regard for the people who lived there. The investigation began to gather momentum. The pressure on the police department intensified, and soon the district attorney's office was involved. Raymond's case had become more than just a personal matter. It had grown into a battle for accountability, transparency, and reform. But with the growing scrutiny came a new challenge: how to bring the full extent of this corruption to light without putting his own career and safety at risk. As the investigation into the police department's practices continued, Raymond felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. Every day brought new revelations, new pieces of evidence that pointed to a system that was fundamentally broken. He couldn't help but think back to his own experiences as a young black man trying to make his way in a world that constantly tried to keep him down. But this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the people who had suffered in silence for years, all the voices that had been silenced by a system that wasn't built for them. His legal team continued to uncover damning evidence, and soon the media picked up on the revelations about the department's internal memos. The city was in an uproar. Protesters took to the streets, demanding accountability, justice, and most importantly, change. The movement had spread beyond Raymond's case. It had become a call to action for people all over the country who were tired of seeing the same injustices repeated over and over again. But not everyone was on Raymond's side. Some powerful figures in the city began to question whether this investigation was getting out of hand. They feared the backlash could damage the reputation of the entire police force and the political establishment that had supported it. Some tried to discredit Raymond, accusing him of using his position for personal gain, of making a mountain out of a molehill. The media coverage became polarized, with some outlets supporting Raymond's cause and others casting doubt on his intentions. Raymond didn't let it shake him. He had been through too much to back down now. The weight of history pressed down on him. The responsibility he felt to make sure this moment counted was immense. He wasn't just fighting for justice in his case, he was fighting for the future, for the generations that would come after him. It was during one of the most intense days of the investigation that a breakthrough came. Raymond's legal team received an anonymous tip from someone inside the police department. The tipster had access to classified files that contained detailed records of every stop, every arrest, and every interaction between police officers and citizens in the wealthy neighborhoods. The files were damning, showing how deeply ingrained the practice of racial profiling was. The tipster also provided evidence that the department had been covering up incidents like Raymond's for years, routinely sweeping them under the rug to protect their own. Raymond's legal team worked quickly to authenticate the documents. Once confirmed, they knew they had the smoking gun they needed to take down the department. The tipster's evidence would be the key to bringing the entire operation to light. But it came with risks. If the department found out where the leak came from, they would stop at nothing to cover their tracks. Raymond felt the gravity of it all. It wasn't just about taking down a few corrupt officers anymore. It was about dismantling an entire system that had allowed these abuses to go on unchecked. And while he was more determined than ever to see it through, he knew that the road ahead would be even more dangerous than before. The day Raymond had long dreaded and anticipated finally arrived. The trial was set to begin, and the courtroom was filled with the tension of a battle that transcended the individual case at hand. What started as a personal injustice had evolved into a nationwide cause, and the stakes could not have been higher. This wasn't just about Raymond Johnson anymore, it was about the very principles of justice, equality, and accountability. Raymond stood in the courtroom, his usual composure betrayed only by the subtle tightening of his jaw. As he looked around, he saw not just his legal team and the opposition, but a sea of faces: reporters, civil rights activists, protesters who had come to support him, and even people he didn't know but who had somehow connected to his cause. There was a quiet weight in the air, a sense that this trial was more than just the sum of its parts. On the opposite side sat the defense team, led by a sharp, experienced attorney named Matthew Coulter, whose job was to paint the actions of the officers as a simple misunderstanding. An overreaction, perhaps, but not one driven by racial bias. Coulter was a seasoned litigator, and he had a reputation for defending the most high-profile cases. This was his moment to defend the police officers, to protect the system from what could be a damaging verdict. Raymond's legal team, led by Sarah Mitchell, had spent weeks preparing for this moment. They knew the case was far from simple, and with the media watching every move, they needed to be flawless. But there was more than just legal strategy at play. Raymond's case was about changing hearts and minds. They had to prove not just that the officers were wrong, but that the system itself was complicit in perpetuating the kind of discrimination that had led to this very incident. The trial opened with the prosecution presenting the evidence: the body cam footage, the witness statements, and the testimony of the tipster inside the police department. The footage from the bystander's phone was played in court, showing the moment Raymond was handcuffed for looking suspicious. It was a painful image to watch, especially as the judge asked the jury to consider how a man with Raymond's background, a renowned lawyer, could have been treated this way. Raymond sat silently as the video played. His face remained composed, but his mind was racing. This was the moment when everything hinged on the jury's perception of him. They had to understand that his case wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. He had fought for justice his entire life, and now it was his turn to hold the system accountable. The defense team was quick to counter the charges. Coulter's first move was to paint Raymond's stop as an unfortunate but understandable mistake. The officers, he argued, had acted in good faith, under pressure to maintain safety in a neighborhood known for its affluence. The officers didn't know who Raymond was when they stopped him. They didn't know he was a prominent lawyer. They were simply doing their job, following protocol. "There's no question that racial profiling is wrong," Coulter said in his opening statement. But in this case, there was no intent to discriminate. The officers acted on instinct, and yes, maybe they were too quick to judge. But that's all it was: an unfortunate misjudgment. The jury seemed to listen carefully, but Raymond's heart sank. Coulter's argument, while technically sound, ignored the elephant in the room: the systemic nature of the problem. The jury needed to understand that the officers' actions were not just mistakes. They were the result of years of unchecked behavior, a culture of bias that had been quietly woven into the fabric of law enforcement. Sarah Mitchell rose to her feet when it was her turn. The defense may want to claim that this was a mistake, that these officers were simply doing their job. But let me ask you this: when does a mistake stop being a mistake and become something much darker? She asked, her voice unwavering. When does a pattern of behavior, repeated time and time again, stop being an accident and start being institutionalized racism? The room fell silent as Sarah made her case. She didn't just talk about the events of that day. She spoke about Raymond's life, his journey as a lawyer, and the countless others who had experienced the same kind of treatment. She brought up the officer's history of racial profiling, the internal memos from the department that encouraged these kinds of stops, and the reports from other community members who had suffered in the same way. The truth is, this wasn't an isolated incident, Sarah continued, her voice rising with emotion. This was a product of a system that has been built to protect the privileged and ignore the rights of people like Raymond Johnson. People who have spent their lives fighting for a fair and just society, only to be treated as less than human because of the color of their skin. The jury listened, some visibly moved by the weight of her words. Sarah was no longer just a lawyer in a courtroom. She was a voice for the voiceless, and in that moment, She captured the essence of the fight they were all a part of. As the trial progressed, the prosecution continued to present its case, highlighting the systemic issues at the heart of Raymond's story. But the defense wasn't done yet. Coulter's team worked tirelessly to try and discredit Raymond's testimony. They questioned his motives, they questioned his past, and they even tried to turn the public support in his favor into something manipulative. "Mr. Johnson," Coulter asked pointedly during cross-examination, "you've been in the public eye for years, advocating for justice, for fairness. But do you honestly expect us to believe that you, a man of such high stature, a respected lawyer, a man who has worked so closely with the police, didn't know the risks of being stopped in a neighborhood like this?" The question hung in the air. Raymond took a deep breath, his mind flashing to all the times he had fought to change the very system that was now under scrutiny. He wasn't here to play games. He wasn't here to protect his reputation. He was here for something bigger than himself. "I didn't ask for this," Raymond said, his voice steady, "but I won't back down. And no, I didn't know that walking home from work would lead to me being handcuffed and treated like a criminal. And I shouldn't have to." The courtroom fell silent once again. His words struck a chord with the jury. This was no longer just a legal case, it was a moral one. The question was no longer whether Raymond had been wronged. The question was whether the system that had allowed this to happen would ever be held accountable. As the trial reached its climax, Raymond's team presented their final arguments. The tension in the courtroom was thick. The jury was deliberating. The room was quiet, filled with an unspoken anticipation that seemed to hang in the air. The weight of the moment was almost too much to bear. Raymond knew that this could be his final chance to change the course of history. He could feel the eyes of the nation on him, waiting for the verdict that would shape everything. Would the system that had wronged him finally be held accountable? Would the officers face consequences for their actions? The verdict arrived on the morning of a rainy Tuesday, as Raymond sat nervously in his lawyer's office, waiting for news. The trial had been grueling, but after weeks of legal battles, testimonies, and emotional speeches, the jury had reached a decision. Raymond could feel the weight of it all. His heart pounded in his chest as Sarah Mitchell walked into the room, her face calm but unreadable. He stood up from his chair, his palms sweating. "Sarah, please," Raymond said, his voice tight with anticipation. Sarah took a deep breath before speaking, her gaze steady. "We won, Raymond. The jury found in your favor. The officers involved have been held accountable. And this case has been deemed a clear instance of racial discrimination." Raymond's knees almost buckled with relief. The years of fighting, the sleepless nights, the endless pressure, it had all led to this moment. The officers who had stopped him unjustly, who had profiled him because of the color of his skin, were now facing consequences for their actions. It wasn't just a personal victory, it was a victory for all those who had been wronged, for all those whose stories had been ignored or dismissed. But it was more than that. This was the beginning of something greater. The case had drawn national attention, but the implications of the verdict were even more significant. The ripple effects were already being felt in communities across the country, sparking conversations about police reform, systemic racism, and the need for change in the justice system. In the days following the trial, Raymond found himself thrust into the limelight in ways he had never imagined. The media coverage intensified, and he was asked to speak at rallies, on news programs, and at town halls. His name was on the lips of every commentator, every politician. His victory had become a symbol of hope for many who had suffered in silence for far too long. But amidst the praise, there were also detractors. People who believed the trial had been sensationalized, who accused Raymond of seeking revenge rather than justice. But Raymond had prepared himself for this. He wasn't here to satisfy the critics. He was here to make a difference, to push for lasting change. As he spoke at various events, he made it clear that the fight wasn't over. Yes, the officers had been held accountable, but the larger issue, the systemic inequality that allowed for incidents like his to occur, remained unresolved. And it wasn't just about the police anymore. It was about every institution that perpetuated discrimination, about every system that allowed injustice to thrive. Raymond's speeches became more than just statements of fact, they were calls to action. He urged people to continue speaking out, to keep demanding change. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that this moment had sparked a fire, one that couldn't be extinguished. In the aftermath of the trial, the police department took a hard look at its practices. The investigation revealed not only the misconduct of the officers involved but also a troubling culture of racial bias that permeated many departments across the country. As part of the settlement, the department was required to undergo mandatory reforms, including anti-bias training for all officers and changes to the way they were instructed to patrol neighborhoods. The police chief, who had once defended the actions of the officers, was forced to resign amidst the scandal. The department, which had been slow to acknowledge the issue of racial profiling, was now under intense scrutiny. But Raymond wasn't satisfied with the resignation of a few individuals. He pushed for broader reform, changes that would prevent future incidents, changes that would challenge the deeply rooted prejudices that had allowed such behaviors to thrive. Raymond's victory was one step, but the work wasn't finished. He began to work alongside activists, lawmakers, and other community leaders to help push for national police reform. They campaigned for stricter oversight of law enforcement agencies, for changes in the way police interacted with marginalized communities, and for policies that would hold officers accountable not just in rare instances, but consistently. Across the board. In the months that followed, Raymond saw tangible change, but he also saw how much more work there was to do. The fight for racial justice was long and complicated, but the momentum from the case was undeniable. More people were speaking up, more people were willing to challenge the system, and more people were willing to believe that things could be different. One day, as Raymond walked out of his office, he was met with a familiar face, a young black man, perhaps in his early 20s, who approached him cautiously. Raymond recognized the look of uncertainty, the same look he had seen in so many faces before. "Mr. Johnson, I just wanted to say thank you," the man said, his voice soft but full of gratitude. "Your case, it means so much to me. To all of us. You gave us hope. You showed us that we matter." Raymond smiled, feeling a lump form in his throat. "It's not just me," he replied. "It's all of us. We're in this together." As the young man walked away, Raymond stood still for a moment, looking out at the city around him. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't over. But there was something different now. People were beginning to understand that they had the power to change things, that their voices mattered. And for the first time in a long while, Raymond felt a sense of peace. He had done what he set out to do, he had fought for justice. But more than that, he had ignited a movement that would carry on long after the cameras were gone. Years later, Raymond would look back on this moment as a turning point, not just in his life, but in the lives of so many others. The world hadn't changed overnight, but it had shifted. And for that, Raymond was grateful. He had faced injustice, and in doing so, he had helped create a world where such injustices could no longer be ignored. It wasn't just about winning a case, it was about changing the narrative, about standing up and speaking out against the things that had been allowed to go on for far too long. And for the first time in his life, Raymond knew that the world was listening. With a final, knowing smile, Raymond walked down the street. The sun was setting behind him, casting a warm glow over the city. There was still much to do, but for the first time, it felt like they were moving in the right direction. And that, he knew, was enough. This story carries a powerful message about justice, equality, and the importance of standing up against systemic racism. It reminds us that no matter who we are or where we come from, our voices matter, and we can create change when we fight for what is right. Raymond Johnson's journey illustrates that true courage lies not in avoiding conflict, but in confronting injustice head-on, even when it's uncomfortable or difficult. It's a reminder that justice is not just about one person, but about lifting up entire communities and making sure every voice is heard, respected, and valued. Change begins with one person's willingness to stand up, and sometimes that one person can inspire a whole movement. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep up with more inspiring stories that challenge the status quo and ignite change. Your support helps amplify voices that need to be heard. Let's keep the conversation going. Together, we can make a difference.